Okay guys, welcome back. Second half of book 4. Quite a lot of ideas happening here, but I think most of them are quite straightforward, and we're going to be repeating a lot of the things that you know already about appropriateness, about the mean, about excess and deficiencies. Okay, so the next virtue is magnanimity. This is another virtue that, along with magnificence, has attracted a lot of objections. But as we saw with magnificence, if we look at it within the Aristotelian context, it can make sense. That doesn't mean that there aren't objections to it, but it means that if you want to object to magnificence or magnanimity, you need to understand them first and object to what Aristotle said, not some imagined version of what he might have said. So magnanimity is a slightly difficult one to translate. We don't really use that word quite a lot, an odd word, magnanimity, but it kind of means greatness of soul. The person who is very honourable and is aware of their own self-worth. So in itself, like all the virtues, it is in excess, an excess of excellence, an excess of greatness. Yeah? But it's also an awareness of one's own greatness and of the fact that one is worthy of these great things. So the magnanimous person is disposed to think of himself as someone who is worthy of great honours because he is a great person. Somebody who is worthy of little consideration is only modest and moderate, and this is not the magnanimous because he's worthy of greatness. Now this is the difficult bit, and a lot of people don't like magnanimity because of that, because it sounds like showing off. Yeah? But this is not the idea. Modesty is not a virtue here because it pulls back from what the person is like. The magnanimous one is great and is aware of his greatness. So for example, imagine a surgeon who's a brilliant surgeon. He needs to know that he's a brilliant surgeon so that he steps up when a brilliant surgeon is required. When a brilliant surgeon is required to perform a very difficult operation, he needs to be able to assess his own worth as a surgeon and say, I am the person for this job. If the really worthy surgeon isn't aware of how good he is, then he doesn't step up and he doesn't perform the operation, and something has gone wrong here. Modesty is not the right kind of virtue for this sort of situation when somebody is great. Okay. So as with everything, it is a mean because it's a true estimation of somebody's worth, and it is the crown of all virtues because the magnanimous is worthy of the greatest honour. In order to be worthy of the greatest honour, it must mean that he's also virtuous in all the other ways. It can't be that he falls short in something, because if he fell short in some other sphere that belongs to some other virtue, then he would not be worthy of the greatest honour. But he does accept, a magnanimous man, only the right honours, the ones that come to him because of his greatness. This is very important in terms of appropriateness. It's not only just about being aware of who you are and why you're a great person and what it is that makes you a great person, but also being aware of the exact kind of honours that are appropriate because they are based on the fact that you are a great person. So they're not superfluous honours, or they're not honours which try to perhaps sway you in a particular direction by sucking up to you, for example. No, they have to be honours that are related to the greatness. They are honours that celebrate the greatness of the virtuous person. So if ordinary people confer honours for trivial reasons, then this is not something that the magnanimous is attracted to. So Aristotle recognizes quite quickly that sometimes we honour the wealthy or the powerful or the high-born, the aristocratic, the blue-blooded. But none of these are the things that he's thinking about here, because magnanimity is a virtue and it has to be related to an orientation towards the noble and the good. Remember, the eudaimon life has nothing to do with the acquisition of wealth for its own sake, or the acquisition of power for its own sake, or the admiration of an aristocratic family for its own sake. These gifts can be given by fortune to anybody, and it might be that the magnanimous also has these gifts of fortune. He happens to be wealthy, but it's because of his magnanimity that he's able to bear the gifts of fortune correctly. So if somebody else was wealthy, they could allow this to mislead them into thinking that wealth is the important thing here, and to mislead them into thinking that they're honorable because they're worthy. But the magnanimous does not make that mistake. The magnanimous understands that true worth comes from moral greatness, and it has nothing to do with wealth. And if he happens to have wealth, well then what he does, the distribution of this wealth, will be enlightened by the fact that he's a virtuous person. He will also be magnificent, for example, with this wealth. Okay, then Aristotle has a very long list of ways in which the magnanimous gets it exactly right. This is a really good example of appropriateness based on particular situations. So the magnanimous has a particular approach that's dependent on his relationship to each particular person he comes across with and his relationship with those people, and the effects this has on honor and admiration. So for example, he only applies himself to important tasks because he's too valuable to waste on something that's not important. He only takes appropriate risks, risks that bring honor. So he wouldn't risk his life for something silly, but he would risk his life for the polis, for the city, for everybody else. Okay, so only worthwhile risks. He prefers to confer benefits rather than accept them, because to accept benefits indebts you to others. If he does accept benefits, he repays them with interest, so that he's not indebted in anybody else, so he's not beholden to anybody else. And he's not impressed by power as such, he's only impressed by the noble and the good. But he's not dismissive of his inferiors, so just because he's in a superior position doesn't mean that he treats other people badly because of it. He does not gossip, he does not complain over nothing, so he's not whingy either, and he's not highly strung, so he doesn't get stressed easily. You can see how all these are very different, diverse things, not being gossipy, not being whingy, not being complaining, not being highly stressed, but they all come from his perception of what is worthwhile. If you understand what is worthwhile, you'll understand why you shouldn't gossip and harm other people, because this kind of information exchange in order to make fun of somebody or to reveal a juicy secret is not worthwhile. It's not an honorable kind of thing, and he's not that sort of person. Okay, so one virtue associated with honor, but honor itself has many different perspectives, and it can apply in many different kinds of situations. About gossiping, about complaints, about being whingy, about being stressed over nothing. All these are kinds of things that are illuminated once you understand what is worthwhile and what it is that you should be concerned with. Okay, the deficiency is a slightly difficult word, pusillanimous. Even I can't say it. I don't think there are many people who can say it, but it kind of means poor-spirited in this respect. Okay, this is a deficiency of understanding how honourable you are. You do not accord yourself the proper honour. You feel unworthy of what is your proper due, and in some respects you must lack self-confidence to have the deficiency. The conceited person is a lot easier to understand. He's just foolish. He lacks self-knowledge. He accords himself much greater worth than he truly has. So he's just not aware of who he really is. Funnily enough, it's the poor-spirited that interests Aristotle more, the defective one. He says this one is the worst because it prevents great men from being truly great. So this is the person who is great, but is not aware of it and doesn't step up to the honours and presumably the responsibilities that go with these honours. He doesn't step up to his greatness. Now Aristotle doesn't actually say this here, but it is possible that he's thinking here of the Athenian citizen who one of his primary obligations towards the polis is to be a politician, to step up, to lead others. So if you're pusillanimous, then you're lacking self-confidence, and you never understand what your greatness is, therefore you don't take up the mantle of your greatness, therefore your greatness doesn't give back to everybody else. It might be that he has this idea here of the politician who stays in the shadows, who doesn't come forward to lead and fulfill his civic obligations. That's why he might feel that the poor-spirited one is actually a worse vice than to be conceited. It's a bit like the petty vice, the vice of the person who has great wealth but doesn't share it in the appropriate way, in their magnificence. Okay, now he moves on to a rather quick discussion of loads and loads of other things, but I think they're quite straightforward. They're not that difficult to understand. He starts off by reminding us that the way we had magnificence, which is concerned with a huge amount of wealth, and liberality, which is concerned with modest amount of wealth, we have the same kind of analogy here between magnanimity and an unnamed virtue that is concerned with modest amounts of honor, to which there can be an excess and a deficiency. So while magnanimity has to do with the man of greatness, the man of a lot of worth, perhaps there is a disposition with respect to smaller honors for people who are more ordinary. And even there you can get it wrong by an excess and a deficiency. Then he moves on to discuss patience. Now, patience here is a slightly technical term. It is a mean with respect to anger. And irascibility is the excess of anger, the tendency to become angry when one ought not to become angry over things that do not deserve this amount of feeling. But therefore, don't think that patience is about being stoical, to being removed from feeling. This is not Aristotelian at all. Patience is about showing the right amount of feeling at that sort of situation. It is not indifference to anger, it is the right response. You can be indignant when that is what is required by the situation. He does warn us to err more towards forgiveness, because I would assume he understands that anger is the kind of feeling that has the power to overpower us quite easily. And he thinks that to be excessively angry is to be foolish, but also to be deficient in anger is to let yourself down. Now, imagine somebody who has been insulted really badly and reacts meekly. He's letting themselves down. He ought to be standing up for himself and becoming angry because of the insult. Okay, and there is a long list of a variety of different angry people, and it's a good example of Aristotle's interest in psychology. Aristotle is always interested in the different ways in which human psychology works. So he talks about the irascible, the people who explode really easily but get over it quickly as well, or others who are quick-tempered. They just arrive to anger very quickly. Others who are bitter, who hold on to their anger for a very long time and can't let go. So various different ways in which you can get it wrong, all of them with an excess of anger, but the aspects in which the deficiency manifests itself are really complex, which is, I think, very convincing given human nature. Okay, the excess of anger seems more opposed to the mean, of course, in this kind of case. It is more common and it is more difficult to live with. Somebody who angers very quickly at the wrong things, too strongly, too much. But Aristotle warns us, as always, that it is not easy to determine the right amount of anger, especially when you have this kind of overwhelming emotion like anger. And there is a lovely quote here which really captures everything that he's been trying to say in Book 4. And the quote is, "It is not easy to define by rule how and how far a person may go wrong before he incurs blame, because this depends upon particular circumstances and the decision lies with our perception." This is an extremely important quote which sets up a lot of the modern discussions between virtue ethicists and rule-based theories. And the critique of the idea is that you can't have a rule, a universal principle, that will give you an answer when the answer is so complex and diverse. The answer lies with perceiving what is happening in this particular case. You can't know in advance how much anger is the right amount of anger until you know the particulars of the situation. And what is the right amount of anger will be determined by these particulars. It is not determined by some pre-existing rule. It will change every time. Okay, so much for anger. He moves on now to a virtue that again doesn't quite have a name, but is a little bit like friendliness. Don't confuse this one with friendship. Friendship is going to be discussed extensively later on. Friendliness is a kind of a disposition to respond appropriately to other people. It doesn't involve the strong affection that friendship has. So friendship is a kind of disposition towards a particular person because of who they are, whereas friendliness is a general sentiment, disposition of being friendly towards everybody in appropriate circumstances. So it is the appropriate response to the pleasures and pains that arise in social interactions. It is dependent again on context, and one can go too far by being too quarrelsome. Oh no, that's the deficiency of friendliness, sorry. One can go too far by being servile, by being too over friendly, even to people who don't deserve this kind of friendliness, people who might take advantage of it, for example. Or you can go in the opposite direction, the vice of deficiency, where you become quarrelsome with absolutely everybody for no good reason, because you are deficient in this attitude of friendliness. Okay, next we have a virtue that has to do with truth and falsehood. Again, it doesn't have a name, but we have the vice of boasting, somebody who claims to know more things than he does, or the vice of understatement, somebody who undervalues the kind of things that he knows. The boaster claims qualities that he doesn't have. The ironic man is self-deprecating, is the kind of person who always puts himself down. But the mean is the correct representation of one's qualities. Again, we have a virtue that has a lot to do with self-knowledge. Exactly like we have magnanimity being about knowing one's own worth. This one is the correct representation of one's own qualities and not being too boastful or not being too understated, too ironic about oneself. Now, perhaps the correct word here is truthfulness or something like that, but it isn't about saying something which is true, but rather about somebody who has the right disposition towards truth. He's a lover of truth, and therefore he has a correct understanding of himself and who he is. The boaster exaggerates who he is, usually in order to gain a benefit or because he's just an irresponsible person. And ironical people underestimate who they are. Now here he has a little caveat about ironical people, about people who tend to underestimate, and he says they may seem attractive because their object might be to avoid attracting attention to themselves. So they may be overcorrecting from the fear of appearing boastful. For example, Socrates is a good example of this, of having discriminating qualities with respect to one's own self. So a moderate use of understatement is pleasant and is closer to the virtue, this particular vice. Okay, we're nearly done, just a little bit more. We have one more virtue. This one has to do with social interactions, relaxation, and engaging conversation. How you engage in conversation with other people. And again, we have a virtue and two vices here. The topic is how to be entertaining, how to be funny, how to be witty, how to be a pleasant conversational companion with other people. And you can go too far, and that makes you vulgar. You make jokes which are inappropriate or offensive, but equally you can go to the deficient vice, which means that you refuse to laugh at anything, you refuse to engage with anything entertaining, and that kind of makes you boorish or boring sort of person to others. This is a wonderful account of what it means to be funny, of what it means for a joke to be appropriate. The virtue is to be witty, and to be witty is an expression of your character. So it isn't just about the joke, there is a moral connection to the joke here. Knowing which things are funny and what kind of circumstances is something that comes from your virtue, from your understanding of the noble and the good. It is because the witty are tactful that they know what is the appropriate thing to say and when to say it. And this is very typical kind of thing that some people get wrong. One joke may work in one situation but not in another, or towards one person or not towards another, or at one time but not at another. That means that wittiness is an expression of one's cultured character, and the witty person can limit himself to what is appropriate. That means they can judge what is appropriate, whilst the person who tries to entertain everybody and says no matter what will say anything for a laugh, and he goes to excesses. And the boring person just contributes nothing to the conversation and maybe even takes offense at everything. So we've had 3 social virtues so far, all concerned with some aspect of conversation or social life or social interaction with other people. One has to do with truth, the one that is about truthfully assessing one's own qualities and not being too boastful or not underestimating oneself too much. And 2, which have to do with pleasure, the friendliness, which is different from friendship, and the wittiness that has to do with the appropriate expression of jokes. And to finish, there is a virtue that's translated by a lot of people as modesty. I think this is a little bit misleading. I think shame, a feeling of shame, is the right thing here. It's not a virtue, it's the last. I know I just said this is a virtue, but just ignore me. It's been a very long day. It is not a disposition, it is not a virtue, it is just a feeling, and it's a discussion that comes at the long list of all these virtues. It is a fear of disrepute, but comes from having done something disreputable. So you do something that's wrong, you recognize that it's wrong, and you have a feeling of shame. And it is the kind of feeling that is appropriate to the young because they're still under the sway of their emotions and they're likely to make mistakes. And it is the right response to the mistake. When you are young and you inevitably make mistakes, this is the right response, a feeling of shame to your mistakes. But it is not a virtue, it is not a disposition, because as you develop away from making mistakes. So it is not appropriate for older people, more reflective people, to feel shame because they shouldn't have made the mistake in the first place. This is a very important part of Aristotle's theory, that it is a developmental theory, that there is a long road of character development, and the kinds of things that we say about people who are at the beginning of this road, the young for example, are quite different from the ones we say about those who are nearing the end of this journey, those who have had time to cultivate their character. So at the beginning it's understandable that you'd make mistakes, and there the appropriate response is shame once you've made them in that context. But when you're older, you shouldn't be making the mistakes in the first place. So shame and shameful feeling is only good conditionally. It is the appropriate feeling when one has done wrong, but the virtuous never feel it because they've never done wrong. And there is a slight reference here at the end to the continent and why they might feel shame. But this is a really complex bit that comes later on. So hold on to that thought, and we'll look at weakness of will, continence and incontinence in a couple of chapters. For now, we'll move on to justice, and we'll see what kind of virtue justice is and how Aristotle understands it.